The joke goes, what's the difference between Glasgow and Edinburgh? When you knock someone's door in Glasgow, they say, come in and have your tea. In Edinburgh, they say, you'll have had your tea then. If we just take that across the water to Fife, the phrase goes like this: it takes a lang spoon to sup with a fifer. I say that because I was a minister in Fife for 14 years. If I go to where I was also a minister in Dumfries Baptist Church some 9 years ago, they talk about the Doonhamers. And the Doonhamers are very different from the incomers. I was an incomer. But if you were born and bred in Dumfries, you were a Doonhamer, because if you went to Glasgow, you were always going Doonham. And it begs the question, as a Scottish society, have we ever really been hospitable? If we've got all these wee phrases that we use to describe ourselves. As a church, what does hospitality look like for us? And how far should it extend? My contention is that it requires a conscious effort of some magnitude to offer to be your brother's keeper, to use a biblical phrase. I would also argue that it requires even more effort to receive hospitality than to give it. The key question asked of Jesus by the expert in the law was, who is my neighbour? It's at the heart of the issue of hospitality. Who does our hospitality extend to? Does it extend to the stranger? There is fear associated with strangers. And we live in a world where most people we encounter are indeed strangers. Through over half a century of urbanization, we see more people, but we know them less. The planning structures of housing estates today create or are centred on the movement of cars directly into driveways. I'd almost be tempted to say directly into garages, but nobody actually puts their car in the garage. So it's just directly into the driveway. Out-of-town shops with great parking discourage people walking around their neighbourhood. We've delegated care of the elderly from neighbours to civic society, to institutions, to charitable bodies, to professionals to care. Even the thing described as care in the community is most definitely not care by the community, except through taxation. We have lost or are losing those biblical places, the city gate, the village green, the community centre. Our TVs teach us all about entertainment in our homes, but little about hospitality and what that looks like. And I want to argue that right at the centre of our understanding of hospitality, as opposed to entertaining, is our understanding of Christ. Jesus, as he hangs on the cross, turns to a thief by his side and says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." That's hospitality. He had demonstrated it in his life over and over again, that act of giving and also receiving hospitality. He who was the homeless stranger, who never returns home once ministry begins, but travels from place to place, giving and receiving hospitality amongst the despised and rejected, as well as the wealthy and positioned. He is the embodiment of our understanding of hospitality. A helpful definition of Christian hospitality is given by Dr. Arthur Sutherland in his book, I Was a Stranger. He says this: in the light of Jesus' life, death, resurrection and return, Christian hospitality is the intentional, responsible, and caring act of welcoming or visiting in either public or private places those who are strangers, enemies, or distressed without regard for reciprocation. I love long, complex sentences, and this most definitely is a long and complex sentence. But let me break it down a little. He talks about hospitality is about the responsibility, not reciprocity. It's about laying down ourselves in faith as Christ did, without requirement of response. It's about offering that welcome to someone who may not be able to give it back to you. The second thing he's pointing to is that it is a step of faith in a God who provides, be that protection from the stranger, or finances to feed the lonely, lost, or wandering who you welcome. We see it often in the Old Testament when widows often open their homes to the wandering prophets like Elijah and Elisha. Even when they only have enough food left for their last meal, they offer what they have as a step of faith and trust. It is also a response to our own salvation. We're told in Ephesians 2:12, remember that at that time you were separate from Christ, excluded from citizenship in Israel and foreigners to the covenants of the promise, without hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who once were far away have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Sutherland wrote, the more clearly I see myself as having been once an enemy of God, a stranger to God, as having been once far from God, the more I see my reason for being hospitable towards others. Our very salvation calls us to be hospitable people. And finally, it's an act of witness. We are called to show the love of the Father for all the world, to all the world. For neighbours, defined as those who share our humanity rather than our geography, our social standing, our warmth of relationship. It's those who share our humanity who are our neighbours. It was systems like apartheid in the past that separated people, reducing the opportunity to discover a shared humanity. Slavery achieved the same outcome. Arguably, borders today do the same thing. An arbitrary line in the sand, often changing our attitudes to others, becoming the thing that separates us from engaging in the shared humanity of the rest of this world. How much more care would we take when recycling? If we had sat with Indonesian islanders whose villages will be engulfed by the ocean in 10 years' time due to global warming, how would that make us think about jumping in our cars to even get here today? How much harder would it be for our politicians to send troops into war if they had sat with the women and children of Afghanistan or Iraq before voting in Westminster? What would change in our attitudes to gangs of young people if we knew their parents and the struggles they faced raising children without a father, without an income, without an education, without any meaningful sense of love in their own life? Hospitality breaks through dividing borders, be they societal, geographical, cultural, or language. Who could tell of the impact on our perspective of the other if we were open to be welcomed to their home, to have our feet washed by them, to be fed their bread and have them listen to our story? My history tells me it's not so long ago that Scottish and Irish migrants fleeing starvation or political or religious oppression left these shores and relied on the hospitality of others across another border. Our Christian faith calls us to end hostility by employing hospitality, to go the extra mile, to share a cloak as well as a tunic, to see the other, to hear the other, to assist the other with gladness. Like Jesus healing the man by the pool of Bethesda in John 5. We read these words, "When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he already had been in that condition a long time, he said to him, 'Do you want to be made well?' The sick man answered him," Jesus heard, "Sir, I have no man to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I am coming, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Rise, take up your bed and walk." And immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked. Jesus sees him, he hears him, and he assists with gladness. What about us? How do we respond to the other? I have two case studies to consider before I finish. The first one, and they're where I always forget to click on. The first one comes from the Old Testament, and it's the story of Lot in Genesis 19. Lot welcomes two guests to his home. Lot is a foreigner himself, trying to make his home in Sodom. The text reveals he is still classed as an outsider. They say to him, "Who are you, a foreigner, to tell us what to do?" He's an outsider. He's at the city gates ready to welcome the stranger in the early evening, possibly because he's still seeking community himself, isolated in the city. Of course, the strangers who come, they're nervous about accepting his invitation. There is potential danger for them. Who is this stranger who's inviting us to come to his house? What's his motivation? But Lot is insistent, we're told, and they accept his hospitality. He gives them food, he gives them shelter. As the story unfolds, he gives them security. The prevailing culture of Sodom was not hospitality, it was one of abuse. It was terrifying. It was to drive people out from their city broken and shamed. Yet Lot challenges that culture. He challenges it, claiming an ancient culture, claiming that the visitors are under the protection of his roof and that they cannot lay a hand on them. In giving this protection, Lot then receives protection from the visitors themselves. They drag him back into his own house to protect him from the crowd. They also help him escape to another town where he knows safety for the future. Dietrich Bonhoeffer argues a true vocation means living responsibly by taking up a position against the world, in the world, which is what Lot does in Sodom. My question for your discussion later is, how might we take up a position against the prevailing narrative that draws on our faith heritage? But before we get to that question, a second case study from the New Testament. And the story of Lydia in Acts 16, just two verses, verses 14 and 15. I want to argue that Lydia is an economic migrant. She is a woman from Thyatira plying her trade in the wealthy Roman colony of Philippi. She has moved for economic reasons from one place to the other. Her backstory has always been guesswork for theologians. There's not a lot there to actually say this is definitely her story. Traditionally, she's imagined to be a very wealthy woman at the heart of the society. I'm more convinced of the recent arguments that she's a former slave, set free, but forced to leave Tyre to ply her trade elsewhere, because if she didn't, she'd be in direct competition with her former slave master. More than just a seller of cloth, she would have been involved in its manufacture, which would have put her into the outskirts of the town, because her home would have been her workshop. And if you're going to dye clothes in that area, you're going to be using a lot of animal urine, and nobody's going to like living next door to you. Her home would have been occupied by fellow workers, all of whom would have been women, because dyeing cloth was women's work. Whichever backstory you think is true and you choose, she's an economic migrant. She's seeking community by the river, and she's open to breaking social taboos by inviting Paul to come back to her house and establish his church there. And again, we're told in the text that the invitation is not enough. The host is shown as having to be persistent, insistent, even forceful is the language of the Greek here, to say, you've got to come to my house. And amazingly, she argues her right to give hospitality to the church, not because she's got a big house, but because she's baptized and is a new creation in Christ. The taboos, the boundaries have been smashed by her act of baptism. Just as she was immersing cloth, so she has been immersed, and it has changed who she is. And she understands the implications of that ahead of the Apostle Paul, who she has to convince of her understanding of theology. That I'm now a new person. The boundaries have been broken. You can come back to our place. And she invites Paul to come to her home, breaking the border between them. He accepts, breaking the border down further. And so an isolated female economic migrant becomes a host and the heart of the church in Philippi. And therefore my question that flows from that is, what will it look like for the church to receive hospitality from asylum seekers, refugees, and migrants in the years that lie ahead? If we went to the Brierley survey, we would see it is those economic migrant churches that are growing massively in Scotland at this time. We have lived as a nation in a context widely described as a hostile environment for the person labelled as the other. I believe the key to breaking this hostility is the Christian virtue in action, that is, hospitality. And there I'll finish for now. So,